On the lower locks, near the banks of the Rideau Canal, is one of Ottawa's oldest surviving stone structures. Bytown was the original name for Ottawa, and it was founded in the late 1820s by Colonel John By during the construction of the Rideau Canal. The area was divided into Upper Town, which was primarily Protestant, wealthier, and held English and Scottish settlers, and Lower Town, which primarily was French-Canadian and Irish Catholic immigrants who worked on the canal and lumber operations. Bytown had the reputation of being a rough place, known for ethnic tensions between French-Canadian Catholics, Irish Catholics, and Protestants, but it served as a hub for the lumber industry, which centered around the Commissariat building. First constructed in 1827, the three-story building was a supply depot for the canal project, which is why it is nestled between the Chateau Laurier and Parliament. Today, it's a museum, and its employees know when they're at work, they're inside a hotbed of paranormal activity.
So the other three team members, were waiting by the door to leave, and Glenn was standing in front of the alarm panel when this wooden door in front of him starts shaking, very gently at first, but then with increasing violence, as if something on the other side really wants to get out.
I'm Nadine Bailey, and this is Haunted Canada. Today, we're visiting the Bytown Museum, one of the most haunted buildings in Ottawa. Before European settlers arrived in the area, the Ottawa River was a major route and got its name from the Algonquin word adawe, which means to trade. The surrounding area is the ancestral land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, who had made this their home for thousands of years. Europeans arrived in the early 1800s, and the population grew quickly. By 1826, construction began on what would become the Rideau Canal, but the seed of the canal began much earlier. For that, we have to go back to the American Revolution. For many decades after the establishment of the United States, Americans believed that the conquest of Canada was a piece of unfinished business. If war broke out, the British colony of Upper Canada, present-day Ontario, would be at risk along the St. Lawrence River from Montreal to Kingston. The river, vital for transportation of goods and people to and from the Great Lakes, and could be easily cut off as much of the southern shore was in American territory. This weakness became apparent during the War of 1812, and although Canada emerged unscathed, after 2 years of conflict, it was apparent something had to be done about the St. Lawrence River route. Surveys were carried out to identify a second safe route from Montreal to the Great Lakes. It was decided the best route would follow the Ottawa River, from Montreal to the mouth of the Rideau River, then travel south along the Rideau and through a series of small lakes to the Carathrie River, which emptied into Lake Ontario at Kingston. Unfortunately, the route selected was navigable only in parts. To be used by larger boats, a series of locks between Ottawa to Kingston would have to be constructed. It would be a monumental task and a true feat of engineering, but by the time plans were presented, British authorities were less enthusiastic about the project, especially since relations with the United States had returned to normal. Pushing for the canal was the Duke of Wellington. He was famous for his victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo and was an influential voice in British politics. The Duke deemed the canal project important, and thanks to him, Lieutenant Colonel John By of the Royal Engineers was appointed to oversee the canal project. By arrived in Canada in 1826, and set up his headquarters near the mouth of the Rideau River in a settlement then known as Bytown. Work actually began on taming the rivers in 1827. Colonel By and a small contingent of Royal Engineer officers designed the Rideau Canal, which involved a series of dams and associated locks, which would enable boats to travel from Bytown to Kingston. The original plan for the canal called for the construction of locks that could handle small barges, but Colonel By's considerable foresight included a system for much larger locks. He finally persuaded his superiors to authorize the construction of locks with a minimum size of 134 feet long and 33 feet wide, large enough to accommodate the new steamboats which were beginning to appear on the Great Lakes. The actual construction work was contracted out to private individuals. Most of the locks and dams were built of stone, quarried at the site, while the necessary iron fixtures were forged by local blacksmiths. Jim Dean is the creative director of Haunted Walk, which provides ghost tours through the Bytown Museum. He said the commissariat building, now the Bytown Museum, is a 3-story building constructed of rough, coarse masonry, featuring masonry walls and a gable roof, and it became a hub for the canal project.
That's because it was built in 1827 as part of the construction project that was the Rideau Canal. And this was not a minor construction project. This is one of the most ambitious ones undertaken in the world at that time. A 200-kilometer stretch involving, I believe, 50-some locks connecting Kingston to Ottawa in the event, of course, of American attack. Now, thankfully, that never happened, but the building of the canal itself was extremely dangerous and hard work for the laborers who worked on it. So, the blasting that was necessary to kind of cut the way through the wilderness, which had debris showering down on people, trees falling down, and disease. Swamp fever, malaria, very common at the time. And exact records, unfortunately, were not kept during this time period, but it's estimated somewhere between 500 to 1,000 workers died to build the Rideau Canal.
The laborers' blood, sweat, and tears were responsible for making this feat of engineering a reality. They dug the lock pits, hauled the stones, and built the dams and locks. Workers were mostly French Canadians from Lower Canada, but the canal was also built by immigrants, mostly from Ireland, who were beginning to arrive in Canada in large numbers on account of British rule back home. On the canal, new recruits were always needed to replace workers who had the misfortune of dying during construction. Despite the cost of human life, or maybe because of it, the project was completed in 6 years, and the Rideau Canal was officially opened in the summer of 1832. It was an amazing achievement. It was 202 kilometers long and passed through an unsettled wilderness and also included fortified lockmaster houses and substantial blockhouses at the lock stations, most exposed to possible enemy attack. Jim Dean said the canal project was immediately declared an engineering triumph and continues to be to this day.
And for Ottawa itself, beyond this kind of the legacy of the canal, and obviously it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, it really is kind of in the heart of Ottawa. And the geography, in addition to kind of the history, I think the geography is really important because it sits on the banks of the Ottawa River, which has been used by countless generations by the Algonquin Nation as a waterway and land for their people and their families. But more recently, just up the hill from the Bytown Museum is Parliament Hill. And just across the Rideau Canal from the museum is the Chateau Laurier. And these are very kind of core old school pieces of Ottawa's past.
Measured against the accomplishment, the financial cost was low at only £800,000. But far from applauding the achievement, the British Parliament of 1832 expressed its shock at the expense. By then, Dean said Colonel By had become a very controversial figure because he would often, more or less, steal the best land from local landowners to use for his means. This forced Colonel By to face a parliamentary inquiry into his activities. An intensive investigation absolved him of any kind of mismanagement, but he never received the honors he deserved for what he had achieved. So he retired to private life and died a disappointed man in 1836 in Sussex, England. However, according to Jim Dean, Lieutenant Colonel John By never left.
Now, for those folks who haven't seen the museum, I think it would be best to describe it as almost like a 3-story barn, for lack of a better word, but built out of stone with extremely thick stone walls. It's always kind of cool, when you go in there. But over the years, we've kind of narrowed down who the suspects might be. One could be Lieutenant Colonel John By, as the Rideau Canal was kind of his greatest accomplishment. And there's a statue of Colonel By that actually looks down on the museum today from Majors Hill Park. And some of our groups even have experiences before they enter the museum. Often our groups will see something like a strange, shadowy figure kind of hugging along the outside of the building, and as they get closer, they can't quite make it out. It eventually vanishes or turns a corner.
He's not the only one to wander in the paranormal hotbed that is the Bytown Museum. Dean said another ghost that frequents the museum is Duncan McNab.
And he was a storekeeper at the commissariat, as it was known at that time, when it held the supplies and materials needed to build the canal. And he had a reputation for being a bit of a prankster. For example, large amounts of goods under his care, like rum and things of that nature, would often go missing. And his excuses were, less than convincing as to where this stuff went. And that's because staff and, guests over the years have found that whatever might be haunting the museum has a little bit of a playful side. And one of my favorite stories, which touched back to my youth and a National Film Board animated classic known as The Log Driver's Waltz. Now, I won't sing the song, but it goes, if he goes burling down the white water, that's where the log drivers learn to step lightly. Look it up if you want to see it. I won't put that, that earworm in your head. But there was one staff member there who found that the video displays were just turning on and off on their own. And in particular, it was the one that played the Log Driver's Waltz. So one time the staff member, just fed up, sick of the Log Driver's Waltz coming off when nobody's pressing the button to play it or anything, yells out, "Stop it. I hate that song." Of course, the video immediately stopped. So there's these kind of little moments of pranks that we see that maybe lead us to think about Duncan McNab. But more recently, quite an interesting encounter that maybe pushes us even a little further in that direction. The tour had just begun. We had just entered the museum. And one guest noticed a soldier standing in the gift shop, kind of where we first enter. Now, the guest was not surprised, assuming this was part of the regular tour. Nothing exciting going on. And the soldier said to him, "Why does he keep bringing people here?" Well, the guest, eventually asked his companion and a few other folks if they could, about this fellow. That was the strange part. No one else could see him. So that guest immediately left the museum and sat outside until the tour ended. After the tour, our tour guide has a chance to kind of debrief with the guest and hear all about what they saw and what was going on. And they gave a very detailed description of the uniform in particular this soldier was wearing. And our guide knew that back at our ticket office that night was one of our staff members who was a big historical reenactor who knew all about uniforms. So when they got back and told the story to our teammate there, well, they confirmed that sounded exactly like the kind of uniform that Duncan McNab would have worn in his time in the commissariat building. So Duncan McNab is definitely one of our key suspects, but a little bit more, I would say, like a playful energy than something ominous or truly terrifying.
According to Dean, the more frightening experiences surround a morbid item connected to Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the fathers of Canadian Confederation.
The first is a plaster cast of D'Arcy McGee's hand.
Thomas D'Arcy McGee was an Irish-born journalist, politician, and poet who was dedicated to the cause of Irish national liberation. As he got older, he advocated for minority rights at a time when ethnic and religious identity was intensely political and fraught. He was an incredibly eloquent public speaker and a passionate advocate for Canadian interests. In December 1857, Thomas D'Arcy McGee was elected to the province of Canada's Legislative Assembly. He was one of 3 representatives for Montreal. However, his political transformation ultimately damaged his popularity with Irish nationalists, particularly the Fenians. He began to publicly denounce the growing movement, which was Irish national, in nature similar to what a young McGee would have believed. Because of this shift, he was eventually seen as a traitor by the Irish community.
Now, D'Arcy McGee was a member of Parliament who was assassinated on Spark Street here in Ottawa in 1868. And eventually, big investigation was brought out, and eventually a man by the name of Patrick James Whalen was convicted and eventually sentenced to death for killing this fairly popular politician. And he was hanged at the old Ottawa jail.
The story goes like this. In the early hours of Tuesday, April 7th, 1868, McGee was assassinated outside his Ottawa home. The authorities suspected a Fenian conspiracy and swiftly arrested Patrick James Whalen, who maintained his innocence throughout his trial and was never proven to be a Fenian. Nonetheless, he was convicted of murder and hanged before more than 5,000 onlookers on February 11th, 1869.
Now, we did tours there for about 20 years as well, and there was one very, very peculiar and strange thing that happened, and I don't exaggerate, at least 100 times over that time period. And that would be after telling a story at the gallows, which are built directly into the structure of the old jail, we would come down the stairs and stand underneath the gallows so you could look up and see the trap door. And as we were telling a story there, it was, almost routine that someone in the group would be struck with a nosebleed. Now, there may be explanations from this coming down the stairs, what have you, but the sheer volume was obviously notable to us, a little difficult to explain.
Following McGee's assassination, the Dominion Police was organized by the federal government in 1868 to guard the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. The service also provided bodyguards for government leaders and operated an intelligence service whose agents infiltrated the Fenian Brotherhood. The force was absorbed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in 1920.
As we stopped doing our tours there, we thought, well, this would be kind of a fun story to share in the Bytown Museum with this plaster cast of D'Arcy McGee's hand. Now, why it was his hand in particular gets into some of the gruesome details, is of course he was shot in the back of the head at close range. And They couldn't do a typical Victorian death mask, so they used his hand, with the reason given that he was a particularly eloquent speaker who was known to kind of use his hands. So in the past couple of years, as we've had groups standing in front of the hand, we'll tell the story about the nosebleeds at the jail. And we've now had maybe half a dozen people who have gotten nosebleeds at that point. And we're not sure what to make of that. And it does raise a big question about hauntings. We often think about hauntings being attached to very particular places or particular things. But is it possible our storytelling itself is playing a role with this other object and creating this kind of really unique phenomena? So that's one of my favorite things inside the museum, is this cast of Darcy Mickey's hand.
Dean says the ghoulish plaster cast of the assassinated isn't the only object that sends shivers down the spines of visitors.
The meeting had wrapped up, and Glenn, our founder, and a few other guides had left, realized they forgot to turn on the alarm system. So they came back down. It's now night along the banks of the river by the canal. It's a little bit spooky, as you might imagine. And as they're in there, they decide just to look around briefly because they got a moment or two to check out some of the displays. When they start to hear phantom footsteps in places in the building where they know the four of them are not. And so a general sense of unease, begins to rise in the group. And they wisely, I think, decide, well, maybe it's time to call it a day. So they head downstairs to the gift shop. And at that time, the gift shop was fully enclosed and had a sliding wooden door that separated the gift shop from a Parks Canada exhibit just on the other side. And that's where the alarm panel was. So the other three team members, were waiting by the door to leave, and Glenn was standing in front of the alarm panel when this wooden door in front of him starts shaking, very gently at first, but then with increasing violence, as if something on the other side really wants to get out. And as Glenn is seeing that, he turns to the others to say, are you seeing this? And of course, all Glenn sees is their backs as the three of them run out of the building. Glenn following close after. Now that by itself is a pretty incredible ghost story and very difficult to explain. But when they got outside, what was even more interesting is that the other three had left in a panic, not because they saw the door shaking in front of Glenn, but rather because they heard these heavy booted footsteps on the ceiling coming towards them.
Dean said they started doing haunted walk tours back in 1995, and since then, he has experienced some very eerie things at the Bytown Museum. Dean said that no matter what he's experienced, he gets a real joy in sharing the area's history with visitors, and that includes the spookier side for those brave enough to join one of his tours. Just don't be surprised if you encounter a mischievous store clerk or a legendary visionary while you're there. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Jim Dean from The Haunted Walk for all your help with this episode. Haunted Canada is sponsored by the Edmonton Ghost Tours. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnston with help from Roslyn Kufer. If you'd like to support this podcast, please follow and share. And if you can give us a like and a 5-star written review, that is always appreciated. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube. Or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.